June 4th, 1942, 10:26 a.m. Aboard the Japanese aircraft carrier Akagi, 240 nautical miles northwest of Midway Atoll, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga stood on the flight deck, his eyes tracking something that should not have been possible. American dive bombers were falling from 14,000 feet in perfect 70-degree angles, their approach so precise that he could calculate their release points before the bombs even left their wings. He had 3 seconds to understand what he was witnessing. 3 seconds before the first 500-pound bomb struck Kaga's flight deck, 100 yards to starboard. 3 seconds before everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about American naval aviation was proven catastrophically wrong. The bomb hit exactly amidships on Kaga. Not near the target, not close to the intended point, exactly where it would cause maximum damage. Then another, each bomb falling with mechanical precision onto the most vulnerable points of the carrier's deck. Tomonaga watched the third bomb strike Kaga's forward elevator with such accuracy that it seemed guided by an invisible hand. This was not luck. This was not the desperate flailing of inferior pilots throwing ordnance in panic. This was something the Japanese had not prepared for, had not believed possible. This was American precision. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. To understand why this moment shattered Japanese confidence so completely, you must understand what Japan believed about American pilots in June of 1942. The assessment was not based on propaganda or wishful thinking. It was based on 6 months of systematic observation, intelligence reports, and combat experience across the entire Pacific theater. Japanese naval aviators considered themselves the finest in the world, and the evidence seemed overwhelming. The average Japanese carrier pilot in June 1942 had over 800 hours of flight time. Many had combat experience dating back to 1937 in China. They had trained under the most rigorous program in naval aviation history, where only the top 15% of candidates earned their wings. Their doctrine emphasized perfection in dive bombing and torpedo attack. Pilots practiced for months dropping dummy ordnance until they could place weapons within meters of their targets from any altitude, any angle, any weather condition. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese pilots had demonstrated this capability with devastating clarity. Of the 23 torpedoes launched against Battleship Row, 19 found their targets, an 83% hit rate under combat conditions. But more importantly, Japanese intelligence had systematically assessed American naval aviation capabilities and found them wanting. Reports from the Chinese theater, where American volunteer pilots flew with Chinese forces, described aggressive but undisciplined tactics. Intelligence gathered from the Philippines campaign in December 1941 and January 1942 showed American pilots lacking formation discipline and making elementary tactical errors. The assessment after the Battle of Coral Sea in May 1942 had been particularly telling. Yes, the Americans had damaged the carrier Shokaku and sunk the light carrier Shoho, but Japanese observers noted that American dive bombing accuracy was mediocre at best. The carrier Yorktown's air group had scored only 2 bomb hits on Shokaku, despite multiple attack waves. Most American bombs fell hundreds of feet from their intended targets. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who led the Pearl Harbor attack and was aboard Akagi at Midway, had personally reviewed combat reports from every major engagement. His conclusion was documented in pre-battle briefings. American pilots were brave but poorly trained. They attacked with determination but lacked the precision that years of rigorous training provided Japanese aviators. In a battle of skill versus courage, skill would prevail. This assessment was not racism or cultural superiority. It was cold analysis based on observed performance. At Coral Sea, American torpedo bombers had achieved exactly 0 hits. Despite launching multiple attacks, their torpedoes ran poorly. Their approach angles were wrong. Their coordination with dive bombers was non-existent. The Americans attacked in separate waves, allowing Japanese fighters to intercept each group individually. It was the tactic of pilots who had trained together for months, not years, who understood theory but lacked the instinctive coordination that came from thousands of hours of formation flying. So when Commander Fuchida stood on Akagi's bridge on the morning of June 4th and watched American torpedo bombers attacking without fighter escort, his assessment seemed confirmed. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the carrier Hornet pressed their attack with suicidal courage, flying obsolete TBD Devastator aircraft straight into concentrated anti-aircraft fire and swarming Zero fighters. All 15 planes were shot down. Not one torpedo hit. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor floating in the Pacific, watched his entire squadron annihilated in less than 10 minutes. Fuchida felt a mixture of respect and contempt. The Americans were throwing away their lives with nothing to show for it. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next. 10 of 14 planes were destroyed. No hits. Then Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. 10 of 12 planes shot down. No hits. In 40 minutes of sustained attack, 41 American torpedo bombers had pressed home their assaults. 6 returned to their carriers. The other 35 were floating wreckage or sinking into the Pacific with their crews. The torpedo attack achievement: 0 hits on Japanese carriers. 0 damage to any Japanese ship. The only result was the complete destruction of 3 American torpedo squadrons. From Akagi's bridge, the battle appeared to be unfolding exactly as planned. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo had repelled massive attacks without suffering a single hit. His carriers were intact. His aircraft were being prepared for a devastating counterstrike against the American carriers that scout planes had finally located. The scene on Akagi's flight deck at 10:20 a.m. represented the moment of maximum Japanese confidence. 36 aircraft sat in launch position. 18 Aichi D-3, Naval dive bombers armed with 500-pound bombs, and 18 Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers carrying Type 91 aerial torpedoes. Each aircraft was fueled, armed, and ready. Pilots sat in their cockpits, engines warming. On Kaga's deck, another 30 aircraft waited. On Soryu, 21 more. The Japanese counterstrike force totaled 87 aircraft, enough to sink every American carrier in the task force. These were not hastily assembled attacks like the desperate American torpedo runs. This was a precisely coordinated strike by the most experienced naval aviators in the world, flying the best carrier attack aircraft in any navy. The Aichi D-3A dive bomber, which Americans would codename Val, was a masterpiece of precision bombing design. It carried a 500-pound bomb and could dive at 70 degrees while maintaining perfect stability. Japanese pilots could release from as high as 8,000 feet or as low as 1,500 feet with equal accuracy. At Coral Sea, Vals had achieved multiple hits on Yorktown. The Nakajima B-5N, the Kate torpedo bomber, was even more formidable. It carried the Type 91 torpedo, which ran at 43 knots with a warhead containing 450 pounds of high explosive. At Pearl Harbor, Kates had demonstrated their capability by sinking battleships. Their pilots could drop torpedoes from 60 feet altitude at 170 knots airspeed and place them within meters of their target. Admiral Nagumo gave the order to launch at 10:20 a.m. The carriers began turning into the wind. Within 5 minutes, all 87 aircraft would be airborne, formed up, and heading toward the American fleet. The destruction would be methodical and complete. Japanese doctrine called for concentrated attacks that overwhelmed defensive capabilities through sheer weight of precise ordnance delivery. No American carrier could survive 18 torpedo hits and 20 bomb hits, and the Japanese pilots about to launch could deliver that level of destruction. They had done it at Pearl Harbor. They had done it to the British carrier Hermes in April. They had done it to dozens of Allied ships across 6 months of uninterrupted victory. Then Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey arrived overhead with 32 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise. The time was 10:24 a.m. McCluskey had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over 2 hours. his fuel gauges dropping toward empty ocean, following the wake of a lone destroyer that was racing to rejoin the main fleet. He had made an intuitive decision that his career, his life, and the entire Pacific War now depended on. He had followed that wake northeast. Now he pushed his SBD into a 70-degree dive from 14,000 feet. 31 more Dauntless bombers followed him down. What happened in the next 5 minutes would destroy not just 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, but the entire foundation of Japanese naval aviation doctrine. On Akagi's bridge, Commander Fuchida heard the scream of the dive bombers seconds before he saw them. The sound was distinctive, not the roar of level bombers or the drone of torpedo planes, but a rising shriek as aircraft fell at terminal velocity with dive brakes deployed. He looked up and saw 3 black shapes, plummeting toward Kaga. The first bomb released at 2,500 feet. Fuchida's trained eye tracked its fall, 4 seconds from release to impact. In those 4 seconds, he calculated the trajectory. The bomb was not falling in the general direction of Kaga. It was falling toward a specific point on Kaga's deck. The bomb hit exactly where Fuchida knew it would, just aft of the island superstructure, precisely amidships. The explosion detonated aviation fuel and armed bombs on the flight deck. A second bomb hit near the forward elevator. A third hit the port side near the flight deck edge. A fourth struck Kaga's bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his staff. 4 bombs. 4 hits. The accuracy was impossible. But Fuchida was watching it happen. Simultaneously, Lieutenant Richard Best's section attacked Akagi. Most of the American dive bombers had attacked Kaga in a target fixation error, but Best had pulled his 2 wingmen out of their dives and headed for the Targa-bound second carrier. His bomb hit Akagi precisely amidships, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar deck. Fuchida felt the shock wave lift him off his feet. The explosion came from below, from the hangar deck where torpedoes and bombs were stored. Secondary explosions began immediately. He struggled to his feet and looked toward Kaga. The carrier was erupting in flames. Then he looked starboard and saw Soryu also burning. 3 carriers hit simultaneously. The scene was, in his later words, horrible to behold. But what made the scene truly horrifying was not just the damage, it was the precision. 17 American dive bombers had attacked the 3 carriers. 13 bombs had hit, a 76% hit rate. This was not the performance of poorly trained American pilots throwing bombs in panic. This was better accuracy than Japanese pilots achieved in training exercises. This was better than the hit rates at Pearl Harbor. This was impossible. And it was happening. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie led Yorktown's 17 dive bombers against Soryu. 3 bombs hit in quick succession. The first near the forward elevator, the second amidships, the third aft. Each bomb struck within 50 feet of where it needed to hit to cause maximum damage. Aviation fuel ignited. Bombs and torpedoes exploded. Within minutes, Soryu was a blazing wreck. The attack lasted 5 minutes from first bomb release to last. When it ended, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were mortally wounded. More than 240 aircraft were destroyed, either burned on the flight decks or trapped in the hangar decks below. Over 700 highly trained pilots and aircrew were dead or dying in the fires, but the true shock was still registering in the minds of surviving Japanese officers. American dive bombers had just demonstrated precision bombing accuracy that equaled or exceeded Japanese capabilities. Everything the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about American naval aviation was wrong. Standing on Akagi's bridge as smoke poured through the hatches, as secondary explosions rocked the carrier. As the order came to abandon ship, Commander Fuchida understood what he had witnessed. The Americans were not inferior pilots learning their craft. They were trained, skilled aviators flying a superior dive-bombing platform with doctrine and tactics equal to Japan's best. The SBD Dauntless, which Japanese intelligence had dismissed as obsolete and inferior to the IHED-3A, had just demonstrated capabilities that no Japanese assessment had predicted. The Americans had achieved what the Japanese considered the pinnacle of naval aviation: precision dive bombing under combat conditions against maneuvering targets defended by fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Admiral Nagumo, shaken by explosions and forced to abandon Akagi's burning bridge, climbed down a rope to escape the flames. His staff followed. They transferred to the light cruiser Nagara. From Nagara Bridge, Nagumo could only watch as his striking force burned. The counter-strike that was supposed to destroy the American carriers would never launch. The 87 aircraft that had been moments from takeoff were now funeral pyres. The pilots who would have flown those missions were dead or abandoning ship. The most experienced carrier air groups in the world were being consumed by fires, started by bombs that fell with mechanical precision from American dive bombers. On Kaga, damage control parties fought desperately, but the fires could not be contained. Multiple bomb hits had created separate fires that merged into an inferno. The carrier's damage control systems had been designed for single hits, not simultaneous multiple explosions. Water mains ruptured, power failed. Communications between decks were cut. Captain Okada was already dead, killed by the bomb that struck the bridge. The senior surviving officer gave the order to abandon ship at 4:50 p.m. 267 men perished aboard Kaga. The carrier that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had raided Darwin, that had driven the British from the Indian Ocean, sank at 7:25 p.m. on June 4, 1942. Soryu suffered the fastest death. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto refused to leave his ship despite orders from his executive officer. He would go down with his vessel. The fires burned through Soryu's relatively thin hull more quickly than the larger carriers. The ship developed a severe list. At 7:13 p.m. Soryu rolled over and sank, taking Captain Yanagimoto and 71 crewmen with her. Akagi burned throughout the afternoon and into the night. Fuchida, rescued from the destroyer that had picked him up, learned that his flagship was beyond saving. The fires had reached the magazines. Torpedoes and bombs stored deep in the ship were exploding. At 4:55 a.m. on June 5th, destroyers fired torpedoes into Akagi's hull. The carrier that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, the pride of the Kido Butai, slipped beneath the Pacific at 5:20 a.m. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But one carrier remained. Hiryu had been several miles north of the other three carriers during the American attack. She had escaped the devastation. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi immediately prepared a counterstrike. At 10:50 a.m., while the other three carriers burned, Hiryu launched 18 dive bombers, escorted by 6 Zero fighters. These aircraft found and attacked Yorktown, scoring 3 bomb hits that started fires and knocked out the carrier's boilers. Hiryu launched a second strike at 2:30 p.m. 18 torpedo bombers escorted by 6 Zeros found Yorktown again and scored 2 torpedo hits. The damage was catastrophic. Yorktown took on a severe list and was abandoned. For a brief moment, Japanese officers aboard Hiryu allowed themselves hope. They had struck back. They had damaged an American carrier. Perhaps the battle could still be salvaged. Then, American scout planes located Hiryu. At 5 p.m., 24 Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise attacked. 4 bombs hit Hiryu. 2 near the forward elevator, 2 amidships. The accuracy was identical to the morning attacks. Bombs falling from altitude with precision that Japanese training doctrine said required years to develop. Yet these American pilots, many fresh from training, were delivering it consistently, repeatedly, lethally. The bombs started fires that quickly spread through Hiryu. Aviation fuel ignited. The hangar deck became a mass of flames. By 6:30 p.m., Hiryu was burning out of control. Admiral Yamaguchi refused to leave his flagship. He and Captain Tomio Kaku stayed aboard the burning carrier, preferring death to the dishonor of survival after defeat. At 2:30 a.m. on June 5th, Hiryu was scuttled by torpedoes from Japanese destroyers. Yamaguchi and Kaku went down with their ship, along with 392 officers and men. The scope of the Japanese defeat was almost incomprehensible, but what made it truly devastating was not just the loss of 4 carriers. It was the realization that American naval aviation had achieved a level of precision that Japanese intelligence had assured them was impossible. In the hours after the battle, as survivors were pulled from the Pacific, as destroyers rescued men from burning carriers, Japanese officers began the painful process of understanding what had gone wrong. The conversations aboard rescue vessels, in sick bays, on the bridges of cruisers and battleships, all circled back to the same impossible fact. American dive bombers had achieved hit rates that exceeded Japanese performance. Commander Fuchida, recovering from his injuries aboard a destroyer, requested all available intelligence reports on American dive bombing doctrine and training. What he read contradicted everything he had witnessed. American pilots received approximately 200 hours of flight training before carrier qualification. Japanese pilots received over 800 hours. American dive bombing training emphasized speed over precision. Japanese training emphasized perfection through repetition. Yet the Americans had just demonstrated precision that Japanese doctrine said required years to develop. The contradiction was maddening. Either the intelligence was wrong, or something fundamental about American training methods was not understood. The truth, which would only become clear through post-war analysis, was that the Americans had developed a weapons system, not just an aircraft. The Douglas SBD Dauntless was not superior to the Aichi D-3A in speed or maneuverability. In fact, the Japanese Naval was slightly faster and more agile, but the Dauntless had been designed from the beginning as a precision bombing platform. Every aspect of its design contributed to accuracy. The aircraft featured perforated dive brakes that deployed from the trailing edges of the wings. These brakes were not merely speed controllers. They stabilized the aircraft during the dive, preventing the buffeting and yaw that threw off bomb trajectories. A Japanese pilot diving at 70 degrees had to fight his aircraft to maintain the proper angle. An American pilot in a Dauntless deployed his dive brakes and the aircraft held its angle automatically. The bomb sight was equally sophisticated. The Dauntless used a reflector sight that projected aiming marks onto a glass panel in front of the pilot. The pilot could adjust for wind, airspeed, and altitude without taking his eyes off the target. The system was intuitive enough that pilots with modest training could achieve accuracy that would have required years of practice in other aircraft. But perhaps most importantly, American dive bombing doctrine emphasized a different philosophy than Japanese training. Japanese pilots were taught to achieve perfection through endless repetition. They practiced the same dive profile hundreds of times until muscle memory took over. The approach produced extraordinary results when conditions matched training parameters. American pilots were taught principles and adaptation. They learned why dive angles mattered, how wind affected trajectory, what altitude provided the best compromise between accuracy and survival. They practiced fewer hours, but understood the underlying physics better. When combat conditions differed from training scenarios, American pilots adapted. Japanese pilots followed their training profile, even when it was suboptimal. At Midway, the American dive bombers attacked from 14,000 feet, higher than standard doctrine recommended. They dove at 70 degrees, steeper than many training exercises. They released at 2,500 feet, lower than the safe minimum. These were not textbook attacks. These were adaptations made by pilots who understood bombing physics and adjusted to circumstances. The result was accuracy that shocked Japanese observers because it seemed to violate the training hours equals performance equation that Japanese doctrine was built upon. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who survived the initial attack and was pulled from Akagi's burning deck, spent his final hours before the carrier sank trying to understand what he had witnessed. He had watched American bombs fall with precision that he, with over 1,000 hours of flight time, could barely match. The Americans who dropped those bombs had perhaps 300 hours total flight time. The only explanation that made sense was that the American aircraft was fundamentally superior as a bombing platform. Not faster, not more maneuverable, but more stable in the dive, easier to aim, more forgiving of pilot error. The Dauntless had been designed to make average pilots good and good pilots exceptional. The Aichi D-3A had been designed to allow exceptional pilots to demonstrate their skill. In a short war with limited pilot attrition, the Japanese approach worked brilliantly. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese dive bombers had achieved devastating accuracy because their pilots had thousands of hours of training and the leisure to set up perfect attacks. But at Midway, the equation had changed. The Japanese carriers were under attack, maneuvering violently, defended by fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Perfect conditions were impossible. The American pilots, with their adaptable doctrine and superior aircraft platform, achieved better results than Japanese pilots would have in the same circumstances. This realization was devastating to Japanese naval aviation doctrine. Everything they believed about training, about the superiority of experience over technology, about the primacy of pilot skill, was called into question by 5 minutes of combat. The statistics told a story that Japanese officers found almost impossible to accept. 13 bombs hit 3 carriers out of 17 dropped, 76% accuracy. At Coral Sea 1 month earlier, American dive bombers had achieved approximately 20% accuracy. The improvement was dramatic, but more importantly, it was consistent. This was not luck. This was not a single exceptional pilot. This was systematic precision delivered by an entire squadron. The psychological impact rippled through the surviving carrier air groups. Japanese pilots who had believed themselves the finest in the world now faced the uncomfortable reality that American pilots in inferior aircraft had achieved superior results. The blow to confidence was incalculable. Pilots began questioning their training, their doctrine, their aircraft. More seriously, they began questioning whether Japan could win a long war against an enemy that could produce precision, weapons systems, and train pilots to use them effectively in months rather than years. The material losses were catastrophic enough. 4 fleet carriers sunk, 248 aircraft destroyed, approximately 3,000 men killed, including hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots. But the psychological loss might have been worse. The belief in Japanese superiority, in the inevitability of victory through superior training and fighting spirit, had been shattered by American bombs falling with mechanical precision onto the most vulnerable points of Japan's most powerful weapons. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding the combined fleet from the battleship Yamato hundreds of miles away, received reports of the disaster with growing disbelief. His staff presented him with initial damage assessments: 4 carriers burning, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, all hit by multiple bombs. The precision of the American attacks was specifically noted in the reports. Officers who witnessed the bombing described it as unlike anything they had seen before. At 2:55 a.m. on June 5th, Yamamoto issued the order to withdraw. The Midway operation was over. The invasion fleet turned for home. The withdrawal was humiliating, but worse than the humiliation was the dawning understanding of what the battle revealed. American industrial capacity was already known to be superior, but Japanese strategy had assumed that superior training and fighting spirit would offset material disadvantages. Midway demonstrated that the Americans had closed the training gap faster than anyone predicted. If American pilots with a few hundred hours of training could achieve accuracy equal to Japanese pilots with thousands of hours, then the entire foundation of Japanese naval strategy was flawed. The war plan had assumed a short conflict where Japanese tactical superiority would force a negotiated peace before American industrial advantages could manifest. But tactical superiority no longer existed. American dive bombers were as precise as Japanese dive bombers. American torpedoes, while still plagued by defects, were improving. American doctrine was proving adaptable and effective. The only remaining Japanese advantage was experience, and experience died with every pilot lost. At Midway, Japan lost hundreds of veteran pilots. The training pipeline could not replace them, not because Japan lacked brave young men willing to fly, but because the training system was designed for quality over quantity. It took 2 years to produce a fully qualified carrier pilot under the Japanese system. America was producing combat-ready pilots in 6 months. The mathematics of attrition became brutally clear. Japan could not afford to trade pilot for pilot with the United States. Every Japanese pilot lost was effectively irreplaceable. Every American pilot lost could be replaced in half a year with a pilot whose training, while less extensive, was apparently sufficient to achieve combat effectiveness. The precision dive bombing demonstrated at Midway proved that American training methods, combined with superior aircraft design, produced results that matched or exceeded Japanese capabilities. In the months following Midway, Japanese naval aviation began a slow, irreversible decline. The carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, damaged at Coral Sea, returned to service but with depleted air groups. Replacement pilots lacked the experience of the men lost at Midway. Training standards were gradually lowered to increase throughput. By early 1943, Japanese carrier pilots were entering combat with perhaps 600 hours of training, down from 800 hours before the war. By mid-1943, training time had dropped to 400 hours. By 1944, new pilots reached their carriers with as little as 200 hours total flight time. The quality decline was catastrophic. These minimally trained pilots faced American aviators who now had the experience advantage. American pilots who survived their first few missions accumulated combat experience that made them progressively more dangerous. Japanese pilots died in their first engagements before they could gain experience. The cycle was vicious and unstoppable. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the American fleet in what American pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Over 300 Japanese aircraft were shot down in a single day. The American pilots who intercepted them reported that the Japanese formations were poorly coordinated, that individual pilots made elementary tactical errors, that the attacks lacked the precision and determination that had characterized earlier Japanese operations. These were not the veterans of Pearl Harbor and Midway. Those men were dead, lost in battles across 2 years of sustained combat. These were replacement pilots with minimal training flying into concentrated anti-aircraft fire and radar-directed fighter interceptions. The slaughter was comprehensive and one-sided. The precision dive bombing that had shocked Japanese observers at Midway was now completely reversed. American dive bombers achieved hit rates that exceeded anything seen earlier in the war. Japanese dive bombers, when they managed to reach their targets, scattered bombs randomly around American ships, with hit rates below 10%. The SBD Dauntless, supplemented by the newer Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver, had become the dominant dive bombing platform in the Pacific. American pilots, now with years of combat experience, could place bombs with accuracy that Japanese pilots in 1942 would have found impossible. The weapons system approach that created the Dauntless had been expanded to other aircraft. The Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber incorporated similar design philosophy. Stability over maneuverability, systems that assisted the pilot rather than requiring perfect technique, doctrine that emphasized principles over rote memorization. American aircraft design had recognized a fundamental truth that Japanese design philosophy missed. In a long war with high attrition, the side that could train adequate pilots quickly would defeat the side that required years to train excellent pilots. Adequate pilots in superior aircraft outperformed excellent pilots in adequate aircraft. This was the lesson of Midway, written in the smoke rising from 4 burning carriers. By October 1944, when the Japanese carrier force made its final appearance at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the carriers were essentially empty. They carried few aircraft and had almost no experienced pilots to fly them. The carriers were used as decoys, sailing north to draw American attention while Japanese battleships attempted to attack invasion beaches in the Philippines. Admiral William Halsey took the bait and chased the Japanese carriers north. American airstrikes sank all 4 Japanese carriers: Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda. The attacks were methodical and devastating. American dive bombers achieved hit rates approaching 80%. Bombs fell with the same precision that had destroyed Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu at Midway, but now the Japanese had no counterstrike capability. Their few remaining aircraft were shot down before reaching their targets. The path from Midway to Japanese defeat was linear and inevitable. The moment Lieutenant Commander McCluskey's dive bombers achieved 76% hit rates against maneuvering carriers defended by fighters and anti-aircraft fire, the template was established. American naval aviation could achieve precision equal to Japanese capabilities, while producing pilots faster and in greater numbers. Industrial capacity would compound this advantage until Japanese resistance became unsustainable. The Japanese officers who survived Midway and lived to see the war's end understood what they had witnessed on June 4, 1942. Commander Fuchida wrote in his post-war memoir that the battle doomed Japan not because of the carriers lost, but because of what the battle revealed. American pilots were not inferior. American doctrine was not inadequate. American aircraft were not obsolete. The entire premise of Japanese strategy was flawed. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who commanded the carrier striking force at Midway, never recovered from the defeat. He was relieved of carrier command and sent to progressively less important posts. In July 1944, during the Battle of Saipan, Nagumo committed suicide rather than face capture. The man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had commanded the Kido Butai through 6 months of unbroken victory, died knowing that the disaster at Midway had been the beginning of the end. Rear Admiral Taimon Yamaguchi, who went down with Hiryu, was considered one of the most brilliant officers in the Imperial Japanese Navy. His death deprived Japan of a leader who might have recognized the need to fundamentally change Japanese naval aviation doctrine. But even Yamaguchi, had he survived, would have faced the impossible task of rebuilding a system that required years to produce results when the war was being decided in months. The American pilots who participated in the Battle of Midway understood that they had accomplished something extraordinary, but most did not realize how extraordinary until after the war. Lieutenant Commander McCluskey, who led Enterprise's dive bombers, knew he had hit the carriers. He knew the attacks had been successful, but he did not know that his pilots had achieved hit rates that shocked Japanese observers and invalidated fundamental assumptions about training and experience. Lieutenant Richard Best, who pulled out of his dive on Kaga to attack Akagi instead, scored one of the most important bomb hits of the battle. His single bomb penetrating Akagi's flight deck and detonating in the hangar set off the chain of Tupper, explosions that doomed the flagship. Best later learned that Japanese officers had specifically noted the precision of that hit in their reports. The bomb had struck exactly where it needed to for maximum effect. Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, who led Yorktown's dive bombers against Soryu, achieved 3 hits with his squadron. The precision was such that Soryu's captain Yanagimoto reportedly told his officers that the Americans had achieved perfect dive bombing. Perfect. From a Japanese carrier captain who had witnessed years of Japanese training exercises and combat operations. The highest compliment possible, delivered in the moments before he went down with his ship. The Douglas SBD Dauntless continued in service through 1944, gradually being replaced by the larger and more powerful SB-2C Helldiver. But the Dauntless had earned its place in history. At Midway, at Guadalcanal, at the Eastern Solomons, in battle after battle, the Dauntless delivered precision dive, bombing that consistently exceeded expectations. The aircraft sank more Japanese shipping than any other Allied aircraft type during the war. Its success was not due to superior speed or firepower. The Dauntless was slower than most fighters, carried a relatively light bomb load, and had modest defensive armament. Its success came from the integration of design features that made precision bombing achievable. The perforated dive brakes that provided stability, the reflector sight that simplified aiming, the rugged construction that allowed pilots to pull out of steep dives consistently. These were system-level advantages that compounded pilot skill rather than requiring exceptional skill to overcome aircraft limitations. Japanese aircraft designers, when interviewed after the war, acknowledged that they had not fully appreciated the importance of dive bombing accuracy as a weapons system requirement. The Aichi D-3A was designed to allow skilled pilots to achieve precision. The SBD Dauntless was designed to provide precision to pilots of varying skill levels. In a long war with high pilot attrition, the American approach proved decisively superior. The philosophical difference extended beyond aircraft design to training doctrine. American pilot training emphasized understanding principles so that pilots could adapt to changing circumstances. Japanese training emphasized perfecting specific techniques through endless repetition. Both approaches produced effective pilots initially, but only the American approach produced pilots who could maintain effectiveness as battle conditions evolved and training time compressed. By 1944, American naval aviators were achieving combat results that would have been considered impossible in 1942. Pilots with less total flight time than the Japanese pilots at Midway were achieving higher hit rates, better coordination, and more effective tactical adaptation. The learning curve was steep, but American training methods and aircraft design enabled pilots to climb that curve faster than Japanese training could produce replacements. The final irony of Midway was that Japanese observers witnessed their own future destruction and could do nothing to prevent it. The moment Fuchida watched American bombs falling with precision onto Kaga's deck, he understood that Japan's assumed advantage in pilot quality was not as large as believed. The moment the second and third carriers were hit with equal precision, he understood that American pilots were not inferior, just differently trained. And in the hours after the battle, as the full scope of American dive-bombing accuracy became clear through survivor reports and damage assessments, Japanese naval aviation leadership understood that their strategy was unsustainable. But understanding the problem was not the same as solving it. Japan could not suddenly develop new training methods or design new aircraft. The industrial base was too small. The resources were too limited. The time was too short. The Battle of Midway was decided in 5 minutes of dive bombing, but those 5 minutes revealed a 3-year trajectory. From June 4th, 1942, when American pilots achieved 76% hit rates, to June 19th, 1944, when American pilots achieved over 80% hit rates, while Japanese pilots struggled to reach 10%. The curve was relentless. American performance improved. Japanese performance declined. The shocking discovery was not that American pilots could achieve precision dive bombing. The shocking discovery was that they could achieve it with less training, in less time, and in greater numbers than Japanese pilots. The weapons system approach, combining aircraft design with training doctrine and industrial capacity, had created a capability that individual skill and fighting spirit could not overcome. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, who witnessed the first bombs falling on Kaga and somehow survived to be rescued, died 3 months later at Guadalcanal. He was flying a Zero fighter on a combat air patrol when American F-4F Wildcats shot him down. His experience, his training, his skill, all accumulated over years, died with him in the waters off the Solomon Islands. He was 23 years old. His replacement in the carrier air group had 400 hours of flight training, half of what Tomonaga received. That replacement lasted 2 missions before being shot down by an American pilot with 6 months of training flying an aircraft designed to offset skill differences through superior systems integration. This was the reality that the Battle of Midway revealed. Modern warfare favored systems over individuals, industrial capacity over fighting spirit, adaptable doctrine over perfect technique. The Americans who flew SBD Dauntless dive bombers at Midway were not Superman. They were young men, most in their early 20s, with a few hundred hours of flight training and no combat experience. But they flew an aircraft designed to help them succeed. They followed doctrine that taught them to adapt. They were part of an industrial system that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. Those advantages, compounding over time, proved decisive. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.